We're good. All right, so my first question for you is, what is the main role of the United Nations today?
All right. Well, I should begin, first of all, just by saying I have my own perspective on the United Nations. So my work has primarily been through the United Nations University, working in the area of education for sustainable development. And my other perspective is a philosophical perspective. I teach philosophy at Luther College here at the University of Regina. Our philosophy department has just signed this memorandum of understanding with SEDA, so it's exciting to be part of your debating process. And I was a debater way back when, too, so I'm happy about that. But as a philosopher, then, I also have my own perspective that often focuses on issues of governance and ethics, some political philosophy, and so you'll see me bringing up perhaps those ideas in relation to the United Nations. So when I looked at the UN and how has it changed, I immediately said, well, what's its purpose? What is it trying to achieve? And I went back to the 1945 Charter of the United Nations to find out, well, what did they say they wanted this thing to do? And it seemed to me there were 4 points. One was to maintain international peace and security. One was to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. And a third was to achieve international cooperation to solve international problems dealing with economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian issues in a way that respected human rights and fundamental freedoms. I thought that was kind of nice. And then finally, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in attaining these common ends. And I thought, well, wow, that was pretty impressive for 1945, given the fact that a lot of the partners that would have been signing on to that weren't even necessarily excited about human rights so much necessarily. But then I thought, well, okay, well, how has this changed? So I went back to the United Nations key documents, its website, and again, it cited its 4 main purposes being exactly those 4 main purposes. So really, from a governance perspective, the core values or purposes of the UN really haven't changed. But that's not surprising, to the extent that in most organizations you often aren't changing those underlying value systems. So then what has changed with the UN? It seemed to me that while the purposes have stayed relatively consistent, the methods for attaining those goals have perhaps changed. And I think that has to do in part with a deeper understanding of how we go about getting at those purposes. So for example, if we think about a lot of the modern social examples, social crises, a lot of these crises in terms of warfare and a lack of peace, the UN, I think, realized over many decades had to do with deficiencies in terms of people's development and their capacities and the resources they had in order to live good lives. And so you see over the last 40 years, 50 years, the UN has really pushed its time horizons, putting a much greater emphasis on future generations and trying to get at the root causes of poverty, trying to get at the root causes of environmental degradation, recognizing that the environment and environmental systems are essential over the long term, those life support systems for the planet. So there's been that shift, I think, conceptually in the UN, and we'll talk a bit about its emphasis on sustainable development. If we think about how the UN plays a role in building up those capacities and capabilities, building up those resources globally, we also have to recognize that the UN is a government system, right? I mean, if you think about what the UN is, it really is a government of governments. So if you think about what has changed in the role of government over the last 50 years, you can then get a deeper understanding of how the UN has also changed in its perspective. So if you think of the power of governments from the 1950s and 60s, where governments were actually very strong, and they had a lot of resources, whereas if you, in the last 10, 20 years, many governments and government institutions have been marginalized. The resources of governments have been constrained in various ways. Their ability to maintain even basic social welfare functions or educational functions sometimes deliberately have been undermined, or the reduction in the tax bases, the move to push money into the private sector, the privatization of state roles. All of that has occurred in a pretty exceptional way in the last decade. So it would be not surprising to see the UN being affected in that way. So then how does the UN shift in relation to that? Well, part of it is the recognition that, okay, if the power of the state has seriously been under decline in the last how many years, the state's capacity to act from a coercive traditional role where it says, we will this or we legislate this. Well, the UN never really had that power at one level. So in a way, the UN has pioneered a lot of state approaches that other governments are now using, I think. But being much more of a broker, recognizing that the state has an ability to centralize knowledge, centralize, mapping, developing indicators of various crises, providing the information sets that people need to make good decisions, brokering different organizations, not just government. Now you see the UN playing a much greater role in bringing in non-governmental organizations, other stakeholders, business as well. So when the UN has a summit, all of a sudden there's a lot more people showing up at those summits, and the UN actually welcomes that diversity. Unlike a lot of global organizations that don't necessarily do that. I mean, compare, say, the United Nations when it holds a summit versus 2 years ago in Toronto when the G8 and the G20 was having its summit. And the fact that you had civil liberties being suppressed, protesters being suppressed, to have the G20 and the G8 cost the Canadian government $860 million to host that event. Well, the UN doesn't have that. When the UN had its Rio Earth Summit just last year, the 2012 Rio Plus 20, I think that went off very well, and they had a very inclusive type of a format. So the idea that it can create a space for international diplomacy, and it's able to integrate a broad range of voices, especially those that normally would not be heard, whether it's a marginalized group or a marginalized country, championing some of the important roles of marginalized groups such as women, or even issues such as environmental issues. I think the UN has played an increasing role as it realizes that if we are going to have lasting peace, global peace, we actually have to tackle those root causes. So that's my view. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you.